Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Tokuskai Inside Look podcast, where I share inspiring stories of budoka around the world. Please share your favorite episodes with your dojo and community so this effort can be spread to more corners of the earth. This episode is brought to you by our amazing patrons over at Patreon. By donating as little as a cup of coffee to a bowl of ramen, they've directly made this podcast possible. If you're enjoying this work and can spare a small tip each month, it would mean a lot to me. I'll also be sharing the occasional behind-the-scenes clips and side initiatives that build on this podcast. You can find it at www.patreon.com/Tokuskai Canada. Thanks in advance for your support. And now, on to the interview. Okay, so this session we wanted to talk about control and calibration. I always mix up if it's calibration and control or control and calibration.
It's not order sensitive. It's like command and conquer. We can swap those around. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's just talk about the beginning. Like, how did you start coming up with something like this?
Okay, so I mean, I was for a couple of months now, knowing that we were going to have this meeting. I've been trying to think about how did it come about, really. And there's so many kind of motivations that caused it. I guess the earliest one was when Iaido Sensei would have seminars in Europe. Quite often there'll be a schedule, like, you know, having the examination on the last day around lunchtime, and then in the afternoon people would sort of start drifting off home because a lot of people had to travel a long distance. So in the last 2 hours or so of the seminar, there'd be only maybe half the people there, and we'd already been through all of the Zenken-ren stuff by this point ad nauseum, and we'd done this from Koryu, and now there was just like this bunch of stayhards who were left. And this was when actually most of the really interesting instruction came, because Sensei would look at a particular part of Seitei, for example, and then he would sort of get a volunteer out and say, okay, show me what you're doing here. And then he would explain why we do things a certain way, not just why we're instructed to do it a certain way in EI, but why as humans we actually do certain movements quite naturally. And he would point out how Seitei, or Iaido in general, is kind of structured around the way that humans work and how the body works, and then how we have to adapt our movements to kind of echo this message that's coming through in Seitei, so that you don't end up doing unnatural movements. So this was really interesting stuff. I'll give you an example. Sensei asked us, why do we do Cybiki when we do Nukitsuke? And, you know, all the sort of normal answers come out saying, you know, you get balance of left and right. He said, yeah, all these are good. These are all good. And then he had somebody sat in front of, or he would sit in front of somebody who was going to do Mai. And he would say, okay, so go into the Nukitsuke position. So let's say you contact here. Now, you can quite easily cut from your left to your right, so this way is quite strong. You can push across, but for me, I can dodge back quite easily. As soon as I see the kisakis coming in from the side, it's not a problem for me to dodge away. So this isn't a particularly reliable strategy for the person who's doing the Nukitsuke. So we said, well, what we should be doing in Seitei, really, because there is this instruction to do Cybiki, is making the kisaki enter here, but aim towards the rear, the left side back of the head. So the kisaki's, if you look at the kisaki from above, it's not only traveling sideways, but it's also going forwards. And he would then get the person to try to make the, after being fully extended to reach the temple in the first instance, he would say, now try to make the kisaki go to the back of the head. And as soon as they do that, they end up having to do Cybiki and sort of rotating their upper body slightly to 45 degrees. Cybiki comes naturally. He said that there you are. That's why Cybiki doesn't just mean taking the sire off the sword or achieving Sayonara, but you actually need it to make sure that you have a forward velocity when you're doing Nukitsuke. So this was kind of mana from the gods, really. And there was loads of little lessons like this, and I thought it'd be really great if this could be incorporated into slightly more formal Iaido instruction rather than just reading from the manual. So years later, I'm finding myself teaching in Poland and teaching in the Czech Republic. So I'm going to Poland like 5 times a year to teach Iaido and Jodo. And most of the guys there are young, smart, athletic, train hard, and they're enthusiastic. So after a few years of kind of reading the manual to them, you kind of run out of things to teach. And this happened surprisingly fast, really, once I was allowed to just kind of let rip. And we couldn't really do much choreo because there was a mixed group of ryuha there. We kind of got through all the seisei stuff, and I was turning up again 2 months after the previous seminar, and it's like, what am I going to teach? I mean, we could just train, but then that's a lot of, you know, people have traveled for more hours than I have to get there. To drive from North Poland to South Poland, it's like 5 or 6 hours. So it's not really fair just to sort of call people together and just train together. That's not really an experience. So I was starting to get a bit stumped about what I should do to progress them. You know, the Polish squad are pretty good, actually, and most of the guys who were coming to the seminars were from the Polish national squad. You know, they've been winning the European Championships a few times up to now, not through any primary influence from me, but because they train hard. They've got people like Moriyama Sensei going there. They had Jock Sensei going there for a few years. Vic Cook Sensei was going there. So there's lots of input from other high grades. And, you know, everything that I could tell them, they'd heard all this before years ago, and they'd been training it to a really high degree. And then I suppose I turned a corner at some point at a Czech seminar I can't remember the second name of this place, where there was 50 people there. And again, some of them were pretty good. There was some beginners there as well. And there was also some high grades who wanted to come along and have their Iaido progressed a little bit, not just turn up to do training. So I remembered that Ishido Sensei has said to all of his high grades a few years previously that if you're 7th Dan in Europe now, you may not be the level of an 8th Dan, but you basically have the responsibilities of an 8th Dan, because there's nobody higher than you in Europe. You have got to now develop the next generation. That's the raison d'etre for having an 8th Dan, is to get the next generation ready and the next generation after that, and prep your next generation to get them to start generating the next generation. So you've got to start this cascade pretty early. Stop focusing on yourself, guys, and think about everybody else that's coming underneath you. And also, don't hold back anything. If you teach everything that you know to somebody, you don't lose anything. You're not giving everything away so that you've got nothing. You're just giving all you've got to somebody. And maybe try to help your students to not fall down the same pitfalls that you fell down. If you spent years doing something wrong and then finally you got it right, don't make your students do the same thing. That's stupid. That makes Iaido go backwards, because there's always more things to do wrong than there is to do right. So stop people from doing the stupid stuff you guys did and get them moving forwards. So this reminded me that what we have to try and do is develop our own skills so that we can grab the people who are junior to us and catapult them over us. Use all of our efforts as teachers and all of their efforts as students to fire them past us, to make them better than we were as quickly as we possibly can. So I started thinking about the fact that I had been working on stupid, trivial things for years, especially in my lead up to 6th Dan. So I was guilty of kind of doing repetitious throcking, just repeating things ad nauseum and still not getting it right, thinking that if I just repeated it enough times, it would just get better. And it doesn't. You end up with RSI and tendonitis instead. So I thought about how people learn to dance, how they learn to drive, how they learn to cook, and how to learn any kind of physical skill which requires a little bit of mental input as well. And I realized that actually we do something a little bit rare in budo, which is we have this faith that if we just throw ourselves at practice and just do practice for the sake of practice, then we hope that we're going to get better. And I think the reality is that if you compare it to other physical things, we're awful at doing that. It's not a working strategy. We should be mindful in our practice, and I don't think we're mindful enough. If anybody's interested in reading about how I spent years throcking for my 6th Dan, I've got a blog called Shugyo, Iaido and Jodo blogspot, and it's I think at the time people were sort of saying, oh, this is a really nice blog, Andy, thanks for doing this. But if I look back at it now, it's just crazy that I spent so much time just basically making the same mistakes. So I'm at this seminar in Czech Republic, and I'm already getting bored of hearing myself. I'm walking around, there's IQs doing certain mistakes, and then there are 5th Dans making the same mistakes. And I could spend a little bit of time with every person at the seminar and make people feel that they're getting some kind of personal feedback. But then there's 50 people there and it's a weekend. At most, you're going to get a few minutes. And then I'll go along and almost say the same thing to somebody else. But then they're also doing something slightly different as well. Or maybe they're doing the wrong thing in a slightly different way. So having a shugo and just explaining something again isn't necessarily going to help. In fact, you probably find yourself with your own students, if you see everybody doing the same thing wrong, you can call them all together and say, guys, do it like this. And then within 5 minutes, most of them have kind of gone back to what they're doing because you've now given them something else to think about, or they're doing the next form and it's the same mistake. So I just thought, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to spend, I'm not going to waste these guys' time and money just reading out the manual and hoping that they get it right. Let's look at some things in extreme detail. So the technique that I picked on, the first dipping of the toe into the water of control and calibration, or calibration and control, was on Morotazuki. So I noticed that when everybody did the initial draw, the initial Nukiuchi, that there was a range of problems. Some people didn't have much power. Some people were lunging their body forwards. Some people had the tip bouncing at the end. And I thought, well, there must be this ideal way of doing this. So why don't we just find the best way, the proper way of doing this, and just do it slowly, understand it, and just practice it like this. And don't put power into it. Don't turn it into a fight. Turn it into a simple physical action. And then I'm just going to sort of step out from the whole C&C thing for a second. The sort of prelude to C&C is that things like fighting spirit and seme and zanshin and kasoteki all kind of detract from your ability to physically do something correctly. Now, I'm not saying these things aren't important, because of course they're important. All the fighty aspect of EI is what brings people to EI. They don't do Iaido to just learn a set of balletic shapes. They do it so they can kind of think about how to fight with a sword. But the problem is that all of the, well, majority of the exams are passed and failed on people's technical ability. And most people actually don't have too much of a problem visualizing, putting a bit of feistiness into their technique, doing correct metsuke, slowing down during zanshin. These are easy bits. These are bits that you could teach somebody to do in a few months. It's all the hard technical stuff that people kind of spend their lives on. So the first thing to kind of get rid of is any pressure on yourself to do it fast, and to instead just promise yourself that you're going to work on just the technique. And all the speed stuff can come later. Just like every physical skill that you learn. So when you learn to drive, you don't get in the car and the instructor doesn't say to you, okay, we need to drive at 30 miles an hour and you need to steer properly and change gears properly, go. You don't do this. You start off driving at snail's pace and you learn all these kind of techniques, how to change gears, how to operate the clutch and the gas so that you don't crash the car. So why not do that with EI and start off with that premise? And then once you pass your test, you can then put your arm on the window and drive one-handed, or steer with your knees at 80 miles an hour, or drinking coffee and using your mobile phone.
Well, I've also found it interesting that, like, when a sensei looks at you and says, you don't look like you have an opponent, the way to fix it is usually not like do it faster or make your eyes look like you have an opponent more. It is some kind of physical, technical thing that you're missing.
Right, so. Right. Exactly, yeah, yeah. And I think the kind of fringe habits, like not having enough control at the end, not being able to generate power, all contribute to that image as to whether or not there is a kasoteki. If your sword's kind of flopping around everywhere and your body's flopping around, then you can quite easily say, you don't look like you're fighting, you look like you're having a fight with yourself. So, back to Czech Republic, back to Morotazuki. We did a series of kind of position checks. So I said to everybody, right, first, everybody grab your sword with two hands, so you're about to draw, and draw until you can get your wrist and your forearm correctly aligned under the hasuji. So they're at the underneath the mune, basically. So the cutting line of the sword should bisect through your arm, just as it should do at the end of a draw or the end of a cut. You know, it doesn't have to go across it or along it perfectly, but it needs to kind of more or less bisect your arm. Otherwise, you're kind of cutting. I don't have many props, I'm afraid. Just grab a ruler. You know, you don't want to be, you want to be cutting something like this, and of course not like this. If this waves in this way, this is quite a weak way to grip the sword, for instance. So, you know, after a few months, I think everybody understands that when we are using the correct tenuichi, that we can squeeze the fingers and this part of the saya hits the bottom part of your palm. So you get a lot of stability and a lot of feeling that you've got power during the cut. If you've got stability, then your muscles will dare to use more power because you know that it's not going to injure you by doing the cut. So anyway, I said to everybody, like, draw until your everything is aligned. Okay, and then max out your Cybiki. And then from here, this is all the complicated movements finished. From here, you should now be able to just extend the sword into the cut. Being careful not to cut through your saya, of course. So you don't need to squeeze. You just need to make sure that all of your fingers are on the tsuka, including your pinky. And you just need to make sure that the hasuji is aligned properly so that you do cut the correct angle from rotazuki. And your wrist is all correct. So from here, it should just be an extension. We did this, and I wouldn't say exactly by magic. It did take maybe 15 minutes. Everybody was doing this draw in rotazuki just many times better than they were doing before. And they didn't actually have to think about anything else, really. Everything else sort of clicked into place. So by having all the hands properly gripping and aligned, the kisaki nicely went up and over and made a nice large nukiuchi. I didn't hear any as the kisaki came out of the saya. Everybody was already coordinating the important bits the first. There's a few more bits to this, which I won't go into too much detail, but of course there was things like getting the Cybiki moving early, getting the rotations set early so that you could get the hasuji aligned in the grip easily. And this just eliminated a whole raft of problems, like people drawing with the hasuji almost vertical and nearly chopping their left ear off. You know, if you hear it whistling past your left ear, this is a danger sign that you may be less one ear when you use a shinken. So this was the start of calibration and control. And it was really about both of those things. It was about saying, you have to get into this position first before you even think about extending into the cut. If you try and push this out with the sword being held in your hand like this and try and change the grip while the sword is already flying through the air, you're not going to get that lovely whistle that you want from the sword. You're not going to feel like you're gripping correctly. You're not going to have stability at the end of the cut. It's all going to be a kind of a mess. So it was a spontaneous kind of thing. You were looking around and you said, hey, let's try this other thing. And then as you built that up, you remembered it when you went back to London or something and started writing this down? Or yeah.
Thinking about it more. Yeah.
I just started thinking about it more, and I realised that I'd done little bits of this with the Polish guys, and also within my dojo, and also on the Shugyo blog, you can see a few attempts of trying to kind of do this calibration. In fact, I'm just going to send you something now. Actually, shall I share my screen? Is that the easiest thing to do?
Yeah, let me give you access.
Great, thank you.
Okay, it should be working now.
Great, just get the thingy up. Right, there we go. Share screen. Okay, and it's this animated.
Oh, I think I've seen this.
Yeah, this was on the Shugyo blog. It must have been a couple of years ago now. It was. I think the article was called "How to Do All the Different Ways to Do Kesagiri Badly." This is Ollie Jarvis from my dojo. He's not by any means a bad practitioner. He's extremely talented. He trains very, very hard. But what he's doing here is pretty much what most of us do, including myself, until I became aware that this was happening. And the meaning of this is that this kind of shark's fin shape that the kisaki makes is what most people do. Now, if you're going to decide in Seita Iai that the opponent doesn't move in kesagiri, that the first cut is supposed to be against the same positioned opponent as the second cut, then something's wrong, because if the position of the opponent is determined by the first upper draw, as it is here, then the second cut's either hitting him with the tsuka or just not really doing anything. Maybe your hands kind of go into the gouge that you've made with the uppercut. So it was an exercise of looking at all of the contributing factors to not having the upper draw and the descending draw, descending cut, running almost on the same line. Doesn't have to be perfect, but the wider this sort of shark's fin shape is, the more it requires your opponent to be displaced between the first and the second cut. Mm-hmm. So the little marks that you can see on the floor is one of the contributing factors, which is if the back foot shifts a bit, then this entire movement will be added to the displacement. So the more okuriashi you do, the more your opponent needs to be displaced. The second contributing factor, it's a little bit difficult to see on the animated GIF. Maybe I can show you in a series of shots instead. Give me a second. I'll just close that.
Did you draw that yourself, or was it?
Yeah, it wasn't as. I just did this using PowerPoint and just converting the video into individual slides. I think using VLC, and then making the slides into a GIF using an online tool. Here we go. We can look. Oh, no, that's not the right one. Sorry. Oh, there we go. So you can see how here this is all fine. This is a perfect position, really. The right hand about shoulder height. No need to duck forwards or anything. No need to push the sword down. But what all of us do is the moment we get saibonare, we start to pull the right hand up too early. Mm-hmm. And we're using tenouchi to get the kisaki moving, but it's too late. The right hand is already raising. And now the kisaki is elevating too quickly in front of you. And it doesn't have that forward velocity that it needs. So it makes quite a shallow cut going up. And then when you get two hands on the sword, you then have the ability to do a good quality cut. And then the kisaki gets cast forwards and you end up in this funny wide shark's fin. So all the things that are wrong there, if you just if you take the pressure off yourself to do it quickly and trying to do it with a lot of sharpness in the cut, and instead just slow down, do it gradually, and look at everything, these two problems of the excessive okuriashi or the pulling up of the sword, these can be eliminated really quickly. Yeah,
you just have to know that you're doing it first.
Exactly this. So as you see from the Shigyo blog, the initial 2 or 3 years, I think, of posts were about being videoed and spending time looking at yourself, which reminded me of somebody recently on your podcast talked about, it was Andy Fisher talking about watching what he was doing after training and comparing it to what the 8th fans were doing in their kendo shield. Mm-hmm. And I thought, good. I'm glad somebody else spent hours after training about 1 o'clock in the morning looking at their evening's training to see what they were doing, because that's what I did. This was back when VHS videotapes were around. My dojo senpai would video me during the evening's practice and then give me the videotape from the previous week, and then I'd go home and just spend hours going through it and trying to see what I was doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, then that means like part of this C&C stuff is, besides not getting your students to repeat the same problems you had, but also not have to go through that level of investigation or filming themselves multiple times and then figuring it out on their own. Too much.
Yeah. I think a little bit of examining yourself and trying to do fault finding and then researching how to get rid of these points. That is useful to a certain degree, but there's only a finite amount of time that you can dedicate to EI and Jodo and other budo. And if you can, doing a little bit of that development's useful, but it gets boring pretty quickly, and you want somebody to kind of say, this is why this is happening, and I went through it myself, so this is what you should do, is get rid of it.
Well, it seems like the ultimate goal is that you're aware of everything yourself, because the only reason you're filming is because you're not aware of it, so you need to see it. So that's already an extra step. But if you're doing this practice, then you're like, okay, I can feel that my arm is doing this. I can feel that my body is shifting this way. You don't have to see it to know, and then now you can fix it right away. Exactly.
Yeah. It's really about being aware of what you're doing and then sort of thinking about why that's happening. And I'm pretty sure 95% of the of the general problems we have in EI, for example, are not made by the fact that we're trying to do it too quickly, but certainly this pressure to do things fast and with semi and power and pressure, it all takes our attention off of it, which brings us on to control theory, I think.
Yeah, so there's all this, we talk about like how it's starting to coalesce in your head, and now it's becoming a system. How did that happen?
So I am an engineer, and I spent quite a few years working on automatic control systems. I'm not a control engineer, so it's not my speciality, but I know a little bit about it. And what I found most interesting was something out of what's called system dynamics, which is PID control and closed loop control. So I won't talk too much about it because it's not that interesting. It's just important to realize that we have it. So closed loop control and open loop control are basically mean either a control system which is based on feedback, or a control system which is just based on an initial evaluation and aiming. So for example, if you fire an arrow in archery or something, to a certain degree, especially to the beginner, you're aiming first, and then you fire and you hope that you hit the target. So this is typical kind of open loop control. Closed loop control is what we do every day with our body. If we go and pick something up, then we don't typically aim our hand and fire and hope that we catch it and hope that all the noise which is affecting our muscles and our joints doesn't make us miss. What we really do, especially if we're having to reach around something to pick something up, is we send a control signal to our hand to move, and then we monitor where our hand is going to, and we then make fine adjustments until our hand reaches the thing, and then we start to rely on sensory feedback. We can feel the thing that we're gripping, and pretty early on we know if this thing is stable or if it's only very precariously balanced, whether it's light or heavy, and then we make all of our gripping movement based upon these signals back upon feedback. So this is closed loop control. We don't simply snatch, usually, unless we are catching something like a fast moving ball, in which case we do closed loop control on our own positioning and where we put our hands. But in terms of catching a ball quickly, we do have to do a kind of open loop control. We may not have that much time to do many feedback exercises to control the catch. We have to kind of hope that we do it, and that's done through practice, of course. So that's the difference between open loop and closed loop control, and recognizing that if we do things a little bit too quickly, then we're not giving ourselves feedback time, and we're not able to do things well coordinated. PID control is basically how your cruise control on your car works. I'm trying to think if there's an easier way to describe it, though, because a car is a pretty difficult one to use. P stands for proportional gain, which is you realize that if you put your foot on the gas on your car, that the number of centimeters or inches that you push down isn't directly reflected in the speed that your car accelerates. There is a kind of multiplication factor between how much you push and what the car then does, how much gasoline, petrol gets into the engine. So this is just a pure multiplication factor. So this is P standing for, depends on which books you read, but mostly stands for proportional gain. I is for integral or integral, which means if you, in a car, if you put your foot on the gas quite hard, if you put your foot on the gas initially and the car doesn't accelerate as fast as you want it to, you give it a few seconds and then you start to put more gas to get it to accelerate in the way that you want it to. So this is about time. If you don't get a response within a certain period of time, you start to add more and more gas or pressure or signal, more control signal into your system. And then D, which stands for derivative. Again, these are all calculus terms. Derivative is that if your car responds a little bit too quickly, if the rate of change is too quick, more than you want, then you tend to take your foot off the gas. So if you're hiring a car and you've accidentally booked yourself a Maserati and you sit in it and then you're at the traffic lights and then you think, I better pull away slowly because there's a police car next to me, and you tap the accelerator and you go zooming off, you immediately take your foot off the gas. So this is about speed of response. rather than duration of response. Now, this science came about from, I believe initially, there's a very good Wikipedia article on PID. Initially, it was designed by observing how human pilots operate large ships. So if you're piloting a big tanker, a big oil tanker, you're probably aware that if you turn the wheel, it takes quite a lot of time before the boat moves at all. It might take a few minutes before you perceive any kind of movement at all. The boat has so much inertia in one direction, and the control surface is so small in comparison to the bulk of the oil tanker. It takes a long time to start moving. And then when it does start moving, once you reach your objective angle, you better start steering back to straight, because it's going to take a long time before the tanker stops rotating. And so engineers who looked at this, who wanted to automate piloting oil tankers or large ships, examined how humans did it, and they noticed that humans are actually really, really good. So they did a lot of studies into the mathematics of what was happening in terms of timing, when the pilot would start turn, where they would go to a maximum and not oversteer, and when they'd start turning back to straight again. And they developed this PID control from that. And it's now become the heart of air conditioning systems, cruise control, possibly your boiler, maybe not your boiler, or maybe your hot water control in your heating does it as well. It all allows things to not oversteer or take too long to reach your desired value. How does that feed into calibration and control? We don't have to worry too much about it, because we do it ourselves quite naturally. When babies and children are learning to move and walk, then they develop these skills, and you don't have to retrain somebody. But what you have to be aware of is that there are PID routines happening when you make a movement all the time. Every single joint that you've got, every muscle, every set of nerves that are being used to feed back to you are doing that. They're all creating this PID control. Your brain is doing the PID control itself, but these are a multitude of signals going backwards and forwards. Now, the thing is that if you learn a complicated skill, it takes a long time to develop that coordination. So I think in my C&C video, on the first or the second one, I talk about juggling. That this is in itself quite a tricky skill to learn, how to position reliably the catching hand, so that you don't actually have to spend any time coordinating this. You throw and it lands in the catching hand. You don't have to concentrate too much on it. But you have to do this at the beginning. You learn to throw the ball and to position the left hand. And then you're learning to throw the ball reliably and consistently. And you're learning that the left, you don't have to put much mental effort into the left hand. It should be in the right place all the time. You might have to return it back, because the left hand is going to throw as well. So you then learn to return your left hand back to the optimal catching position. If we had multiple brains, or more brains than we've got at the moment, then we may not have to learn that skill. We could independently coordinate the left hand and the right hand to do both the throwing and the catching routines individually. I do know one person who's both ambidextrous, and because they've got some kind of brain problem. Well, it's not really a problem, really. It's more of an X-Men skill. On a board, they can write 2 different sentences at the same time. And possibly she can write in 2 different languages, 2 different sentences at the same time. Now, I challenge anybody to learn that as a skill. It's not something that's easily done. And one of the axioms that I've talked about in C&C is that multitasking, we are not as good as we thought we were. Now, the reason why I called it an axiom, which was one of the questions you asked, is that I haven't done these studies myself, but I have read the summary of a few studies which say that, firstly, the act of simultaneous multitasking, we are not that good at. We actually have to spend a lot of time learning how to do simultaneous multitasking. The multitasking we think we're actually doing during a work day, like having multitasking windows and doing spreadsheets and calendars and drinking coffee and answering the phone at the same time. These are not actually, they're a kind of multitasking. What you're actually doing is task switching. So you're switching from one task to another and never really spending a lot of time concentrating on one task. And it has been shown that we are actually less efficient when we have lots of task switching going on, that we have to kind of do a certain period of recalibration of our brains to get back to doing the task that we were doing. And we don't get back up to optimal efficiency until after a certain period of time. So although we think we're smart, that we can do all these different things, in fact, we'd be much better off focusing on a fewer number of things at a time and getting better at doing those. And this feeds directly into the heart of C&C in saying that don't try to do too many things at the same time. And certain things, as I've already talked about ad nauseum, like seme, kasoteki, johaku, leave it. It's not helping. It's more clutter that you don't need.
So just quickly, let's try to wrap up around like a bow around these different theories that you mentioned, like systems dynamics, control theory, PID, and then this multitasking thing. I think starting with just the control, we're talking about is that in order to learn something, we're constantly going one way and another way. We're constantly testing. So there's a lot already going on to learn one thing. The PID part is specifically what are we doing? Are we playing around with like the proportional strength power we're using? Are we adding in the power? That's the integral part. Are we taking away in the derivative part? And then knowing that we're doing all of this stuff, our body has to do all of this stuff. Let's not focus on too many of these things because we'll quickly get overwhelmed, or we'll just skip over. We won't get to the level granularity of these control, I don't know, nudges that we're doing to our bodies to figure things out. That kind of
that's a really good summary of it, really. I mean, the PID aspect of it is extremely difficult. I'm not at a stage in my own development of C&C where I can directly apply PID principles into things. The thing which I thought it would be useful for first, it still needs a lot of research on my side, really, which is when you're doing kiriroshi, where to put the power into. And this is slightly problematic because certain teachers teach different ways. To give an example, I think the way that Oshita Sensei teaches it is quite popular amongst a few of the teachers that travel outside of Japan, which is that the maximum power needs to be occurring at the point of contact. So this movement from furikaburi to the point of contact can be relatively soft, and then there should be a sharp descent during the cutting part. I'm going to be completely honest and say that Iaido Sensei has almost the opposite opinion to this, which is that the important thing is to get your sword on the opponent quickly. And by that point, it's traveling at maximum speed anyway. You don't need to put much effort into getting the sword to cut once it's moving fast. So as far as he's concerned, you should be developing maximum power from the point of furikaburi to the point of contact. Now, I'm not going to say which one is right or wrong. This is purely a philosophical point, and I wouldn't say that you should do anything except follow your teacher's philosophy on this. But there is a PID idea behind how to get the power to appear where you want it to appear, and not spend time laboring up to the point of power, but actually getting some reasonable acceleration going so that you can get some speed, but then you're not using up all of your power too early, so that you end up kind of in this locked position here at the point of contact. Well,
I'm also thinking like that you can take that internally too, because we say we have to use power from the hara. So there's a lot of things in between your hara and your fingertips. There's like your chest muscles, your arm, your shoulder, all that stuff. And it seems like that transference of power, there is going to be some kind of signal that goes from one direction. And then when you have to take it away, you have to, like, how does that even work?
Yeah, and there's also almost certainly going to be a slight delay that you need to account for if you want things to move at the right time and in the right critical sequence, which if we've got time we could talk about, but let me answer anything that you want to ask, Patrick.
I know, I think that kind of wraps up like this, how it was formed because of...
Sorry, my answer. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, so you already had some kind of intuitive sense of a way to practice, and then you kind of applied this professional knowledge you have in engineering to try to figure out what is it that you're thinking of it that allows you to put it into a package, and now you can hopefully start delivering it to your students.
Yeah, although it's vastly underdeveloped at the moment, it's really work in practice. which is why I haven't done that many videos on it.
Well, I think that the concept you brought up that Ishido-san said is just give all that you have right now. And that's what I wanted to focus on too. It's like part of what students can learn from our teachers, not necessarily just their knowledge, but also their process of gathering knowledge. And this is kind of how you're thinking about your practice, and it could help others think about their own practice.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. So you mentioned the first axiom, humans aren't good at multitasking. Could you go over the next couple ones?
Yeah, let me just go back to the document. So the second axiom was objective is to move high-level task into subconsciousness. So this is almost certainly the aim for any physical skill that you learn, whether it's dancing, football, basketball, driving, shooting other pilots out of the sky. When you learn to drive, for example, you almost certainly can remember, I hope, that you spend a lot of your brain resources remembering to, if you're learning manual, if you're learning stick, that you've got to get into the right, you've got to do something with your right hand in Canada and America, left hand in the UK, and you've got to then carefully coordinate the clutch and the gas so that you don't stall the car, and then you're steering at the same time, and you're listening to your driving instructor, and by the time you pass your test, all of this is no longer thought about. And you're doing everything not to the same subconscious level that, say, our brain controls our heartbeat, but certainly it's kind of being done on a mid-level automatic part of our brain. Otherwise, driving would be exhausting, more exhausting than it is. If you were still every 5 seconds checking the rear view mirror and thinking about how to change gear and carefully adjusting the clutch, then this would be awful, wouldn't it? So we almost certainly want to be able to get these routine tasks working automatically in our mid-level consciousness. We don't want to be devoting things to that when we really want to be devoting our high-level consciousness onto things like kizeme, kasoteki, timing, distance, all these other slightly more, how can I say, cloudy concepts that need a bit more concentration. Yeah,
I like bringing up this axiom now, because after all this talk about, there's so many things you can think about how your body's working, all these little control points. The goal is not to just stick at that point. Like once you've played around with those control points, the goal is to bring that back into your subconscious so that you don't have to worry about it.
Right, exactly. Yes, yeah. Of all the things that can go wrong, like not putting your feet under early enough when you're doing the kit scare, there must be a strategy for that to happen automatically, where you don't need to be thinking about it too much. And the strategy I mentioned in one of the videos, which came from Osha Sensei, is if you begin sitting in Seiza with your feet already pushing into the floor, that's a mental resource that you don't have to remind yourself with later on. And that becomes habit, that you sit in Seiza always with that feeling of being slightly buoyant, and then you never have to think about it again. Yeah.
And the third axiom
was best way to do this is through slow repetition of the correct techniques. Yeah, I mean, this isn't I've got no documented evidence for this, except everything that we do in life, that we learn to drive, cook, dance by usually most effectively by doing things slowly and doing the correct technique repetitively, rather than doing what we seem to be doing in Iaido all the time, which is open loop firing an arrow. You kind of do the form quickly and you hope that you get it right. And maybe if you do the form 5,000 times, you might have done it right enough number of times that you might go forward a little bit. But this means that you've maybe done 95% of it incorrectly. And this is just creating more and more bad habits that are difficult to get out of. And, every teacher I've ever met says, don't practice bad habits. These are hard to break, but try and practice good habits. And the best way to practice a good, correct way is to do it slowly and just repeat. You can then do this ad nauseum repetition and throcking, but let's do it mindfully and do it correctly. And if you find that if you go fast, you do it incorrectly, then it's obvious. Don't do it fast. Do it slowly. Yeah.
Well, the biggest barrier to anyone practicing slow, there's the personal interest in just being in a fight and looking like a samurai, like a ninja. But there's also like when Sensei says, you're starting to look robotic, you don't have an opponent. That's like the automatic switch is like, okay, I need to start speeding up and not doing this.
Yeah, but as you've already said, there's almost certainly physical issues that are causing that impression, rather than a lack of speed and power, or the other thing, which is to kind of grimace a little bit more, maybe close your eyes slightly, look like you're growly, and then that often satisfies a lot of people, weirdly.
So we had some notes here that we're talking about specific videos, which are focused on either one part of a technique or another. Do you want to go over that, or just maybe do some broad strokes across the different seitei kata? You could just like name each one and just say, generally when I think about CNC.
Yeah, so actually the one I'd like to talk about, rather than talk about something which is already on a video which people can go and watch, is if I can just share my screen again, because this will take us away from control and onto calibration, if that's okay. And I'd like you to look at this picture here and tell me what you see.
Well, if it's the angle of the camera, one person's hand seems to be higher than the other.
So parallax error almost certainly is having an effect on. So this in white, this is Jesper Waldestal from Sweden, who's a very good friend of mine, and in black is Łukasz Mahura, who you've had on your program already, who's also a very good friend of mine. Neither of these guys are my students, so I don't feel bad about criticizing them. They're good mates of mine. Yeah, so the parallax error does make Jesper look like the hand is a little bit too high up. So let's assume that it is a little bit parallax error, but almost certainly what you can see here is that his hand is probably pretty much level with his shoulder. But doesn't it look beautiful though? Doesn't Jesper look beautiful in this? What is it about this form in the way he's doing it now? And I have lots of photographs of myself doing it in a similar way. What's so wonderful about this? To me, it looks like there's this really powerful straight line starting from his left shoulder, passing through his right shoulder, traveling along his arm, along the sword to the kisaki. It's this beautiful projection, and it looks amazing. And I'm sure I've probably won a few taikai based upon this kind of beautiful, aesthetically pleasing position. And then if you look at Łukasz, this doesn't occur so much. It doesn't quite look so beautiful. So his right hand is definitely lower than his shoulder, but then the sword looks pretty much horizontal. If we look a little bit closer, Jesper has this what's called hanami giri angle to the hasuji. So it's not perfectly laterally aligned. The hasuji is slightly down, which is what we've been taught by a few senseis to do. So that's wonderful. Łukasz is a little bit more lateral there. The hasuji is quite flat, but this is fine. Means it's kind of cutting nice and straight. Maybe makes a nice sound when it comes out. Now the main problem with this is, and this is just down to calibration, there's a slight axiom we have to agree to, which is that at the point of Nukitsuke, either the sword should be, so the actual length of the sword should be either horizontal, or let's agree to a maximum that the kisaki can be level with the bottom of the tsuba. It's just an arbitrary allowance. You know, if I did Nukitsuke and the sword was declined like this, then everybody would say this is ridiculous. This isn't Nukitsuke. Actually, we do that quite a lot. If we try and calibrate the elevation of our sword to flat using our own eyes, because of, again, parallax error, almost certainly the sword is going to be down like this. In fact, let me just go to another quick photograph and you can see another previous guest on Inside Look, which is somewhere, Cedar. So Cedar's also a good friend of mine. I'm sure he won't mind me picking him apart. So almost certainly Cedar believes in this point here, as many of us would, that the blade is about horizontal, and from our eyes it looks like it is, but you can see that actually the kisaki is considerably lower than the edge of the tsuba. Actually, this isn't a particularly bad example, not a particularly good or bad example. It's not an extreme example at all. This is pretty good. But if you video yourself or get somebody to take photographs of you from the side, you'll be surprised how much the sword declines. Now, let me very quickly, I'll jump onto overcompensation, which you talked about with one of the questions you want to ask me, Patrick. Mm-hmm. The method to overcompensate here is to feel like the kisaki should look like it's actually going up. And almost certainly that will mean that the sword is horizontal, but this requires calibration by somebody helping you or videoing you to get the right position. Let me go back to, oh, in fact, there's Martin Lindgren, another friend, saying to Sida, oi, get your Kisaki up. But going back to this one, now the reason why Jesper's example is problematic, it's not declining too much. But if I was to say to Jesper, right, keep your hand in the same position, but just get the sword to be a little bit flatter so that it's a bit more like Wukash's, so it's perfectly horizontal. At that moment, I could get Jesper's clone and sit him in front of Jesper in Caesar, and the sword would perfectly pass over his head. There's that much error, excuse me, between the height that we think we're drawing to in relation to the opponent and the height it actually is. And I do what Jesper does here, and I have to force myself to not do it. Wukash's hand looks like his hand is at chest height. If you sat Wukash's clone in front of him, this would be perfectly aligned to hit the temple and the eyes. But because we don't do these kind of calibration exercises, it's quite often we don't really see that in ourselves. So this is another thing that I did with the Czech guys on that occasion, is to sit somebody in front of each person and say, look, this isn't hitting where you think it's hitting. And most people's either conscious or subconscious strategy is to dip the Kisaki down to reach them, and then it looks ridiculous from the side. But the right strategy is not to draw the sword up towards your imaginary opponent's face, because you'll almost certainly create parallax error yourself, but to draw the sword to your chest. Create a datum, calibrate a datum, a standard position that your hand has to go to, and always draw to that position if you're doing a cut to the eyes. And if you're doing a cut to the door, which we sometimes do in Koryu, then again, create another datum yourself. Don't just do it based upon your own visual judgment.
So in this case, is control like more of the macro movements and calibration the micro movements? Or is it a different?
I think it's more to do with the calibration being part of the finished shape and position. So the static positions we make, are they correct? Yeah, and just using a few strategies to kind of make sure that that's happening. The control bit is almost certainly the system dynamics, meaning it's something which is moving. So it's how we move ourselves into these positions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned one thing would be you sit the opponent in front of them, and then what do you think he should be feeling inside his body that's making the adjustments? Is it like, in this case, is it something in the fingers and the tenouchi and the hand and the wrist and the shoulders?
Do you mean the adjustment of the height of the sword and the height of the hand? So it's a difficult question. I mean, I can answer it for myself, but I'm not sure how it works for other people. Certainly, to get this optimal calibrated position and to get, I think, what would be the right control, we have to do all the things that I mentioned in one of those C&C videos, which is to max out your left hand first, so that becomes something that's a task which is finished and you don't have to devote any resources to Cybiki. And also getting the rotation in at the right time, not too late, because that then becomes another stress on your system control. So don't leave it until the Kisaki before you rotate, because your sword will stop. Or you'll be rotating the sword while it's moving through the air, which is obviously not good. And then hopefully, when all of these things are being achieved in terms of positioning and sequencing and timing, you then should sense that at the moment of Sayonara, the pinky of your right hand is very comfortably in the right position. It doesn't have to be gripping completely. You don't have to be holding like this, but at least the last pad of your pinky is located on the ha side of the tsuka. So the act of doing nukitsuke, the act of creating a nice sharp nukitsuke, is really just about yielding to the slight stress, the slight pressure you can feel in your small finger, and then going against it. And you'll find that the nukitsuke is made with less effort, with less feeling like you're overreaching, with less feeling of shock at the end. And you should be able to create accuracy in your Nukitsuke. And once you can start to feel that you're actually in control of your sword in Nukitsuke, then calibration is really easy. You can then start to decide that I'm not going to cut to this point, I'm going to cut accurately to this point with a little help from your friends. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, actually, that's a very helpful way of thinking about it, is that I think going back to the very beginning where we were saying that there's an optimal way of how the body moves. And if the sword sits in your hand in the right way, if your body's positioned in the right way, like you were saying before, lining the left shoulder with the right shoulder in that nice, like, strong pose, then if you want to do anything outside of that, like minor, then it's easy to do.
Isn't it? Yeah, you're not putting yourself under stress and pressure to make an adjustment with all these other things that you're trying to juggle and balance at the same time. If they're all being put into the background, or you have strategies which mean that they're already happening without you having to think about it, then this makes all the fine adjustments really easy. If I can just very briefly talk about another Iaido sensei thing, which was during actually several of these at the end of the seminar final sessions, he would get people to do forms like Shihogiri or Morotsuzuki, where you turn and see the opponent and then cut. And he would stand there and say, right, my hand is going to be the opponent, and you have to cut to where the opponent is. So for the first few times, people turn around, they see his hand, and they cut correctly to where his hand is. And then after doing this a few times, just as they're about to cut, he then shifts to the side. Maybe he'll step or he'll just move his hand. And then suddenly you find yourself that you're aiming in one direction, and then suddenly you've got to turn and cut into another direction. And he didn't even explain this to us, what the benefit was. It's obvious. If you can do your katas with a certain degree of flexibility and the ability to choose to make last moment changes, then you're no longer tied to the kata. You're not doing the kata as what's called katachi, which just means shape. You're actually putting some kind of content in the kata. It's now becoming a practical, useful exercise in developing your sword. So if you are in the moment that he's moving his hand, if you're being careful to not trip over and you're worrying about whether or not your sword's in the right position, because you've got so much error potential in your furikaburi, because your arms aren't stretched enough. If you don't have that going on, it's easy. You not only can you change your direction, you can turn, start to step forward and then step back. And still do a good quality, because you freed yourself. You freed all the vital bits, which are concentrating on the opponent, instead of dedicating all your mental resources on how do I step without falling over.
Yeah, that's actually giving me a good round picture of why you calling it control and calibration now, because it's really once you have a good control of your body and you know how you should be moving, and then that last bit is. And you mentioned this multiple times too. It's either your own practice, or this sensei says it this way, or this student does it this way, but that's right. This student does it another way, but that's right. This final calibration part is to give you all that flexibility in doing it these different ways. But it only looks good and only works if your human body is working right way, and that's universal to anyone.
Yes, yeah. There's a clip on the C&C video of me doing this 3 different timings of the foot and the kisaki on the Kitsuke. So I actually did this in Spain when I was doing a referee seminar with those guys, and they asked me some questions about this foot timing. And this was actually reminded to me by Robert Rodriguez sensei, who at a different seminar or championships years previously in Poland said, look guys, you can move your foot first, then kisaki, or both at the same time, or kisaki, then foot. But, you can't go out of this range of reasonableness. If you put your foot there first and then 3 seconds later your kisaki arrives, that's bonkers. That doesn't make any sense. But you've got this freedom of choice to the side. What I showed the Spanish guys is that they should be able to do all 3 of these timings. And if they can do it, not just doing it by accident or out of sheer repetition, then they've got some sort of decisiveness behind their technique, and it looks good, it feels good. They can make that decision themselves which one to do. If teacher A says kisaki first, then foot, you can change like that. If another teacher says, no, foot first, then kisaki, you can change like that. Very good strategy for preparing for a grading, where you're often told what you should be doing the morning or the day before the examination itself. If you can quickly adapt, then yeah, that's a grading strategy. What's that got to do with budo? Well, if you can adapt to any situation quickly, that's what EI means, right? The ability to quickly adapt in a everyday situation.
Yeah, I try not to share too many of my own personal, like, direct opinions in this thing, but like this is one of the things that really gets me is when people complain that the ZNKR kata have changed, and they're like, "Ah, they've changed it. How dare they? Yeah, how dare they? Now, like this is so stupid. Now I don't want to continue." It's like, what? Like the whole point is of doing something like this is to be able to change.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I kind of sympathize with that feeling of it being changed, when of course, you know, the writing on the page isn't being changed, and maybe the teacher, they have their own kind of interpretation of what's being written down and being said. But that's refreshing, isn't it? Because quite often, in fact, you know, years ago when we had quite a broad range of Koryu teachers coming to the UK, they would teach their seitei a little bit differently, and that was because their Koryu was influencing their seitei, and that was a really nice kind of spectrum of opinions to see, because you're learning just a huge volume of stuff, and it all makes sense, and it's all logical, and it's just more interesting than trying to create this real kind of dull carbon copy standard way of doing seitei, which, without slagging off the ZNKR online, I feel doesn't really do seitei much service, really, to try to make it too rigid. Having a standard, of course, is important, isn't it? As it's supposed to be something that you're examined against. But it would be nice if there was a little bit of range of freedom to be able to express your Koryu through your seitei.
So I think maybe just jump down to the last couple points. We don't have to spend too much time on it, but general thinking about when to bring in some of these concepts at different levels of practice. So beginner, intermediate, advanced. How do you think about that?
So I think it's really important around sort of third dan to fourth dan that either the teacher themselves or the student starts to use some control and calibration strategy to assist their training. Louis Vitalis sensei said to us years ago that in Japan he learned from his teacher that there's a way of doubling your progress, which is that you don't rely on your teacher. You take as much responsibility for your development as your teacher takes for developing, which is kind of at the heart of it, really. And around third and fourth dan, you already know a lot about what's required of you in terms of technical shape and dynamic performance, and all the other fluffy stuff like kasoteki, etc., metsuke or chitsuke, all this kind of stuff. So you already know that quite a lot, and now you probably need to start thinking, how are you going to massively accelerate your technical ability, which mustn't have anything to do with just muscular development. That's important as well, to get fitter and stronger, but to just basically improve your technique, not through sheer repetition, because life is too short, man, and we all get older and less able to do it. So we better learn quickly how to optimize our practice.
Yeah, and I find that that's the ultimate kind of paradox in this case, is that you have to go slow in order to learn fast.
Yeah, exactly. I can't remember who wrote it. I think it might have been C.W. Nicol in Moving Zen, but he talked about how you develop technique first and speed and power follow naturally, and you can't reverse this equation. And if your technique's not up to it, then you can't do speed and power. You've got to go back to technique. But the meaning of this is that if you work on technique, it's a bit like E equals MC squared, really, that, you know, we have this idea that in a nuclear explosion, mass gets converted into energy, and that's what we think E equals MC squared means. It doesn't mean that. The equal sign means energy and mass are the same thing by the proportion of the speed of light squared. And doing technique correctly makes speed and power. But you can't revert it, different to E equals MC squared. You can't invert this. You can't start off with speed and power first and hope that technique will develop. But they are, you don't have to do a technical practice and then a speed and power practice. Doing technical practice and edging up a little bit each time, or allowing your body to accelerate because it feels comfortable and dynamic and it seems to be working quite well, will lead to speed and power.
Yeah, I'm sure like even a student that was to do this, like practice some specific techniques slowly, getting a good feel of it, and then do it at regular speed, they'll notice it. But even then you could just take a video and just show them that there's this direct effect. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So you also asked about when to start using C&C for juniors as well. Up to sometime, maybe at the beginning of last year, to my local dojo, the one that's just close to me, I had a student who was partially sighted. They couldn't see, they couldn't focus more than, say, a dollar coin at arm's length. So they could see this in focus, this little bit here, but everything else was really, really blurry. And I was teaching him Jodo, which was dangerous because, no, not dangerous, but challenging, because he had to focus on me as the Uchidachi, and he had to worry about his own things. So we, at that point there, where he couldn't even see what he was doing himself that well, he couldn't rely on peripheral vision at all. We had to create a whole raft of things, of calibration points and control strategies so that he could do it. And I have to say, with a little bit of time dedicated of just me and him training together, we did massive progress. We got the first kata in 1 2-hour session. I would say nailed. He could have passed, after he'd only been training like 3 or 4 months, he probably could have passed Nidan on that one kata, which I know isn't going to pass you Nidan, but it was up to Nidan level by that point. But it was very untraditional training, I'd have to say. It was really kind of almost like learning a, not perhaps, well, maybe like learning a dance routine, of just saying, just do the moves, just learn the moves.
Mm-hmm. Do you see this kind of changing the way you structure a dojo, or is it just another concept that you bring in? Like sometimes you'll say, well, let's try doing things with our eyes closed. Let's try doing something. Let's do more embu. Is this just something like part of a class that you would plug in, or is it a general philosophy of training?
It's creeping in involuntarily, by hook or by crook anyway. So I have a few students ask me to help them with their grading preparation, and the first thing I say is video yourself, and then the second thing I say is then watch yourself, and then I will do an evaluation with them, and I'll then say, right, from now going forwards, all evaluations will be done that you video yourself first, and then you evaluate yourself, and then I'll do it. And so we'll have this kind of ability to self-evaluate first. For all within, obviously during lockdown we're not doing much dojo training. We're able to do a little bit here at the moment, and without kind of making a big thing about it, I now use C&C for helping mostly senior grades in my dojo, to help them to get things done smoothly. And although I've in the process of creating a series of C&C strategies for all of Seitei EI, I found that just taking the philosophy and the concept of it, you can almost import it directly into Koryu and help yourself to work your way through the complicatedness of Koryu and the massive increase in coordination that Koryu needs. Just use the strategies like getting Cybiki out of the way quickly, putting more this thing about more left hand, which is what every Japanese teacher shouts at every seminar they've been to outside of Japan. Doesn't mean pull your hand back more. It means probably more awareness, better timing, breaking Cybiki down into several component parts and making sure that they're all achieved. This is now that I don't, like I said, I don't have to do this as a separate thing anymore. I can just style my teaching based on those strategies now. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I like the thing that you brought up, saying that film yourself and assess it, and then go to the teacher, because actually I saw this starting to happen in higher education too. Like right. when I was doing my master's, there was a couple of classes where professors said, okay, you're going to give some videos first of us teaching the subject. You're going to do some homework, and only in class will we talk about it and see what did you learn, what were you missing. And that's kind of that shift. And we, like, often in martial arts we talk about the Western approach, the Eastern approach, but we could see that there's this also change in general learning. Yeah, and it for me too. And I like what you talk about the limited time, because I think about it a lot now, is that we just don't have time to grind through everything. So find the most efficient way of learning. And yeah, if it takes a sensei 70 years to figure something else, it shouldn't take your student the same amount of time. You're not going to get the progress.
Yeah. Why every session do we have to take 3 steps forwards and 2 steps back? Why can't we just be making 3 steps forwards?
Okay, so just to wrap up this kind of initial talk about C&C, because I know you're going to continue evolving it as you think about it. What are some of these things that are kind of broadly in your mind in terms of this concept? Where do you want to take this? You've already done a couple of videos, one on like the Nikitsuke timing, one on the Shihogiri ski, Uke Nagashi footwork. What's the next step?
I want to try and document it as much as I can, really, because I think it's important to start writing now, because it's going to take forever to get it into a state where I think I'd now like people to read this. So I have started writing, and it's going to be difficult to do much more while we're in lockdown. I can do some stuff. I think I didn't run the videos so to kind of prove to people how smart I was. I wanted to get people to give me feedback, and I wanted to hear what people thought about it, because that will help me to develop the ongoing stages of C&C. I can do a certain amount of self-analysis outside in the garden, which is where I do most of my EI training at the moment. And it's been really useful, because I've been doing more training than I would normally do myself. And I don't have to kind of follow anybody's idea as to how fast I should do my kata. And I've got no gradings to worry about at the moment either. So I would like to do more videos and get more feedback from people. I'm really looking forward to lockdown being over and really trying it out on my Polish friends, because they're very responsive, and they won't hold back telling me if they think something isn't working for them. They won't just say, "Yes, sensei." They'll actually say, "I've got no idea what you're talking about," and this doesn't seem to be working for me anyway. So I need to trial some stuff and see how it works on a broad population as well. So far, I think it's been successful in the few exercises that I have done at seminars, but I really want to not make it an academic study, but make it based upon actual experience and trials.
Mm-hmm. So if someone were to listen to this, and this is the first introduction to this concept, what would you recommend them going to ramp themselves up quickly? Like maybe they're Iaido practitioners or someone that wants to think about this more or can provide feedback. So how would they first ramp themselves up to what this is about besides listening to this? And then what's the best way of giving feedback to you?
Oh, good question. I think perhaps so I went back and looked at the C&C videos, and I found lots of things wrong with them. So watching the videos is probably a good step, bearing in mind that it's all still work in progress. Reading the Shugyo blog isn't a bad idea, not because it's written by me, but again, it's based upon experiences of being told things by other people. So it's just a way of documenting this. I mean, the 30-second elevator ride description of C&C is videoing yourself and basing your training on what you're actually doing, not on what you think you're doing.
Cool. So on YouTube, they can search you, Andy Watson, Iaido, maybe adding that term. Shugo blog, again, Google Andy Watson, Iaido, Jodo, Shugyo, Shugyo.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then feedback, just comment on the YouTube video or send you an email or something?
Yeah, either find me on Facebook or comment on the YouTube video. I do get notifications when people comment. That would be really, really useful, guys listening. If you could do that and try it at home and tell me what works for you, that would be really good.
Cool. Thank you so much. I actually had some questions or feedback, maybe, or the more questions, but yeah, they're in the document, so you can just go in and take a look.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But that's for later.
To answer them now? Oh, okay. Yeah.
No, I have to go.
Sure. Yeah, me too. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for your time, Patrick.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
See you tomorrow, maybe.
Talk to you. Yeah, tomorrow. See
Excellent.
you then.
Okay. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode, because we have a lot more exciting conversations to share as we explore the world of the traditional Japanese martial arts. The Inside Look podcast is brought to you by our amazing patrons over at Patreon. If you are enjoying this work, please consider supporting me at patreon.com/Tokuskai Canada. To contribute to this effort, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at tokuskai.canada or subscribe to our newsletter at subscribe@tokuskai.ca. Until next time, thanks for listening.